Have you ever wondered who really controls the flow of history? Not the kings on their thrones, not the generals commanding armies, but the shadows moving behind every major decision that has shaped our world for centuries. Tonight, we're pulling back the veil on one of humanity's most enduring mysteries. Not the Hollywood version you've seen in movies, not the internet theories that flood social media, but the real story of the ancient Illuminati. But before we dive into the shadows, let me ask you this. When you hear the word Illuminati, what comes to mind? Probably triangle symbols, all-seeing eyes, maybe Jay-Z throwing up hand signs. That's exactly what they want you to think. Because while you're distracted by conspiracy theories and pop culture references, the real story remains buried in archives, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone brave enough to connect the dots. Here's what most people don't understand. The ancient Illuminati wasn't some shadowy cabal plotting world domination from a secret lair. It was something far more dangerous. It was an idea so powerful that it threatened the very foundation of how society operated. And ideas, unlike armies or kingdoms, are almost impossible to destroy completely. In this investigation, I'm going to walk you through the true origins of the Illuminati, reveal the real reasons behind their formation, and show you evidence that their influence didn't end when history books claim it did. We'll explore the three key phases of their evolution, examine the documents they tried to destroy, and uncover the network that may still be operating today under a different name. But I have to warn you, once you see the patterns I'm about to show you, you can't unsee them. Once you understand how power really moves through history, every major event starts to look different. Every coincidence becomes suspicious. Every official story becomes a question mark. So if you're ready to go down this rabbit hole with me, to question everything you've been told about who really shapes our world, then stay with me. Because what we're about to uncover together isn't just history. It's the blueprint for understanding how power operates in shadows, how ideas spread through networks, and why some truths remain hidden for centuries. Let's begin where every good mystery should. At the very beginning, in the mind of a man who dared to imagine a world without kings. Bavaria, 1776. The same year America declared independence, another revolution was quietly brewing in the heart of Europe. But this revolution wouldn't be fought with muskets or cannons. It would be fought with books, ideas, and the most dangerous weapon of all, education. Adam Weishaupt was not what you'd expect from the founder of history's most infamous secret society. He was a law professor at the University of Ingolstadt, a scholarly man with wire-rimmed glasses and ink-stained fingers. But behind those quiet academic features burned a mind that saw the world differently than everyone around him. Picture this. 18th century Bavaria was a place where the Catholic Church controlled not just what people believed, but what they were allowed to think. The Jesuits ran the universities, censored the books, and decided which ideas were too dangerous for public consumption. Knowledge was rationed like bread during a famine, and questioning authority wasn't just discouraged, it was heretical. Weishaupt watched brilliant minds waste away in this intellectual prison. He saw students capable of revolutionary thinking forced to memorize approved texts and regurgitate sanctioned opinions. He witnessed the suppression of scientific discovery, philosophical inquiry, and rational debate. And slowly, a plan began to form in his mind. What if there was a way to spread enlightened thinking without the authorities knowing? What if the brightest minds could share dangerous ideas in secret, building a network of rational thinkers who could gradually influence society from within? What if knowledge could flow freely but invisibly? On May 1st, 1776, Weishaupt gathered 4 of his most trusted students in a forest outside Ingolstadt. There, by candlelight, he founded the Order of the Illuminati, not the cartoon villain organization of modern conspiracy theories, but something far more subversive, a secret society dedicated to the radical idea that human beings should think for themselves. The name itself reveals everything you need to know about their true purpose. Illuminati, the enlightened ones. Not enlightened by divine revelation or royal decree, but by reason, science, and critical thinking. They believed that if enough people could be awakened to rational thought, society would naturally evolve toward justice, equality, and progress. But here's where the story gets interesting, and where most people get it completely wrong. The early Illuminati weren't plotting to control governments or manipulate markets. They were teachers. Their weapon wasn't gold or blackmail, it was education. Their goal wasn't world domination, it was world improvement. They developed an intricate system of recruitment, identifying young men of talent and character who showed signs of independent thinking. These recruits weren't told they were joining the Illuminati. Instead, they were invited into what appeared to be a reading society, a philosophical discussion group, or an academic circle. The initiation process was gradual, almost seductive. New members would be introduced to increasingly radical ideas over months or years. They'd read forbidden books, discuss dangerous concepts, and slowly come to understand that the world didn't have to be the way it was, that kings weren't chosen by God, that the church didn't have a monopoly on truth, that ordinary people were capable of governing themselves. Each member was given a classical pseudonym. Weishaupt himself became Spartacus, the name of the slave who led a rebellion against Rome. This wasn't just romantic symbolism. It was a declaration of war against the existing order, fought with ideas instead of swords. The organization grew with remarkable speed. Within 5 years, they had infiltrated universities, government offices, and noble courts across Bavaria and beyond. Members included writers, scientists, government officials, and even some members of the clergy who had grown disillusioned with corruption in the church. But the Illuminati's greatest strength was also their greatest vulnerability. They were too successful, too influential, too visible to those who knew how to look. And in 1784, their world came crashing down. The Elector of Bavaria, Charles Theodore, had been watching the spread of Enlightenment ideas with growing alarm. When he discovered that many of his own officials were members of the Illuminati, he didn't just ban the organization, he launched a systematic campaign to destroy it completely. Police raids swept through Bavaria, seizing documents, arresting members, and forcing confessions. Weishaupt fled into exile, his life's work apparently in ruins. The official story says the Illuminati died in 1785, crushed by the full weight of state power. But here's what the history books don't tell you. Ideas don't die when organizations do. Networks don't disappear when their founders are exiled. And the evidence suggests that what happened in 1785 wasn't the end of the Illuminati, it was their transformation. Because just as the Bavarian authorities were congratulating themselves on crushing the conspiracy, something strange began happening across Europe. Revolutionary movements started erupting with suspicious coordination. Secret societies with remarkably similar structures and goals began appearing in France, Italy, and beyond. The French Revolution, which began just 4 years after the supposed destruction of the Illuminati, bore hallmarks of their thinking: the emphasis on reason over tradition, the systematic dismantling of aristocratic privilege, the belief that society could be rationally reconstructed from the ground up. Coincidence? Perhaps. But when you start looking at the networks of influence, the patterns of communication, and the philosophical similarities, a different picture emerges. Not of an organization that died, but of an idea that learned to survive. And this is where our investigation really begins. Because if the Illuminati didn't die in Bavaria, If they evolved and adapted and found new ways to spread their vision of enlightened society, then we need to ask some uncomfortable questions about the world we live in today. Who shapes the ideas that shape our world? How do revolutionary concepts spread from academic circles to popular culture? And when change happens with remarkable coordination across different countries and institutions, should we assume it's coincidence, or should we start looking for the networks that make such coordination possible? The trail goes cold in Bavaria, but it doesn't end there. In fact, that's where the real mystery begins, because in the years following their official dissolution, something remarkable happened. The ideas the Illuminati championed, religious tolerance, separation of church and state, democratic governance, universal education, didn't disappear. They spread faster than ever before. The French Revolution wasn't just a spontaneous uprising of angry peasants. It was a carefully orchestrated demolition of the old order, executed with surgical precision by men who seemed to understand exactly which pillars of society to topple and in what sequence. And when you examine the revolutionary leadership, you start noticing something peculiar. Take Maximilien Robespierre, the architect of the Reign of Terror. Before the revolution, he was a small-town lawyer who somehow developed a sophisticated understanding of mass psychology and political strategy. His speeches didn't just rally crowds, they systematically dismantled centuries of religious and monarchical authority, using arguments that sounded remarkably similar to those found in confiscated Illuminati documents. Or consider the Marquis de Condorcet, the mathematician turned revolutionary who wrote the blueprint for France's educational system. His vision of universal education, designed to create rational citizens capable of self-governance, was lifted almost word for word from Weishaupt's private correspondence. But here's what makes this truly chilling. These men had no documented contact with the Bavarian Illuminati. No letters, no meetings, no paper trail connecting them to the supposedly destroyed organization. Yet their ideas, their methods, even their organizational structures bore unmistakable similarities to the Illuminati model. This is how you know you're looking at something real. When the same complex ideas emerge simultaneously in different places among people who theoretically have no connection to each other, you're not witnessing coincidence. You're witnessing a network in action, and the network was far more sophisticated than anyone realized. While authorities were congratulating themselves on crushing the Illuminati in Bavaria, members had already established cells in France, Austria, Italy, and beyond. They had learned from their mistakes, adapted their methods, and gone deeper underground. The key was compartmentalization. Instead of a centralized organization that could be destroyed with a single coordinated strike, they created a distributed network of autonomous cells. Each cell operated independently, connected to others through carefully maintained chains of communication that were nearly impossible to trace. Think of it like a spider web. Cut one strand, and the web remains intact. Cut several strands, and the web adapts, forming new connections. The only way to destroy such a network completely would be to eliminate every single node simultaneously, an almost impossible task when you don't know how many nodes exist or where they're located. The French Revolution was their first major success using this new model, but it wasn't their last. In 1776, the same year Weishaupt founded the Illuminati, another revolution was taking shape across the Atlantic. The American Revolution wasn't just a colonial uprising against taxation. It was the first successful implementation of Illuminati principles on a national scale. The Founding Fathers weren't members of the Bavarian Illuminati, but they were definitely influenced by the same philosophical currents. Benjamin Franklin spent years in Europe, moving in intellectual circles where Illuminati ideas circulated freely. Thomas Jefferson's correspondence reveals deep familiarity with the same radical texts that shaped Weishaupt's thinking. But the real smoking gun is the structure of the American government itself. The separation of powers, the system of checks and balances, the emphasis on education and rational debate. These weren't just practical solutions to political problems. They were the systematic implementation of Illuminati philosophy about how enlightened societies should organize themselves. Look at the Great Seal of the United States, printed on every dollar bill. The pyramid with the all-seeing eye. The Latin motto, Novus Ordo Seclorum, a new order of the ages. These weren't random symbols chosen by committee. They were deliberate signals to those who knew how to read them. The eye represents enlightenment, the awakening of human consciousness to rational thought. The unfinished pyramid represents a society still under construction, still evolving toward perfection. And that Latin phrase, it's a direct declaration that the American experiment was intended to herald a new age of human organization. But America was just the beginning. Throughout the 19th century, revolutionary movements erupted across Europe with suspicious coordination. The pattern was always the same. Intellectual elites would begin discussing radical ideas in private salons and coffee houses. These ideas would gradually spread to writers, journalists, and political organizers. Then, seemingly overnight, mass movements would emerge demanding exactly the changes that had been discussed in those private gatherings. The 1,848 revolutions that swept across Europe followed this pattern perfectly. From Paris to Vienna to Berlin, revolutionaries demanded constitutional government, civil liberties, and national self-determination using nearly identical language and tactics. The speed and coordination of these uprisings baffled contemporary observers, who couldn't understand how revolutionary ideas could spread so quickly across different countries and cultures. But when you understand the network that had been quietly developing since the supposed destruction of the Illuminati, the coordination makes perfect sense. Ideas were being transmitted through carefully maintained channels of communication. Revolutionary strategies were being refined and shared. Local organizers were being trained in methods that had been tested elsewhere. The network had learned to work with existing social movements rather than trying to control them directly. Instead of imposing their agenda from above, they would identify natural leaders within legitimate reform movements and gradually introduce them to more radical concepts. By the time these leaders were ready to act, they genuinely believed the revolutionary ideas were their own. This is psychological manipulation at its most sophisticated level. The targets don't realize they're being influenced because the influence feels like natural intellectual development. They discover new ideas at exactly the pace they're psychologically ready to accept them. By the time they're fully converted to the radical worldview, they've internalized it so completely that they become passionate advocates, recruiting others with the same gradual, seductive methods that were used on them. But the 19th century successes were nothing compared to what was coming. As the industrial age transformed how information moved through society, the network adapted its methods once again. They began targeting not just political leaders, but the institutions that shaped public opinion: universities, newspapers, publishing houses, and cultural organizations. The goal was no longer just political revolution. It was something far more ambitious: the complete transformation of human consciousness itself. They wanted to create a world where rational, scientific thinking would replace superstition and tradition as the foundation of human civilization. And as we moved into the 20th century, they got very, very close to succeeding. The question is, did they actually pull it off? Are we living in the world the ancient Illuminati envisioned? And if so, what does that mean for the future of human freedom? Because here's the thing about successful conspiracies. Eventually, they become so embedded in the normal functioning of society that they're no longer conspiracies. They're just the way things work. And when that happens, the most radical transformation becomes completely invisible to those living through it. The networks that emerged from the ashes of the Bavarian Illuminati didn't disappear in the 20th century. They evolved, adapted, and found new ways to influence the flow of ideas through society. But to understand how they operate today, we need to follow their trail through some of the most turbulent decades in human history. The Industrial Revolution didn't just change how we made things, it transformed how ideas moved through society. And the networks that had learned to operate in the shadows of 18th century Bavaria quickly realized they had been handed the most powerful weapon in human history: mass communication. Think about it. Before the printing press became cheap and widespread, radical ideas moved slowly, person to person, through carefully guarded networks. But by the 1852nd, newspapers could reach millions of readers simultaneously. Books could be mass-produced and distributed across continents. For the first time in human history, a small group of influential thinkers could shape the minds of entire populations. The networks understood this shift before anyone else did. While traditional power structures were still thinking in terms of armies and territories, these invisible architects of change began purchasing newspapers, funding publishing houses, and placing their people in editorial positions across Europe and America. But here's what made their strategy so brilliant. They didn't use these media outlets to spread obvious propaganda. Instead, they focused on shifting the underlying assumptions that people used to make sense of the world. They didn't tell people what to think. They changed how people thought. Take the concept of progress itself. For most of human history, people assumed that the best days were behind them, that the golden age had already passed. But throughout the 19th century, a new idea began spreading through newspapers, novels, and academic journals: the belief that humanity was inevitably advancing toward a better future. This wasn't just optimistic thinking. It was a fundamental rewiring of human consciousness. Once people believed that progress was natural and inevitable, they became willing to tear down traditional institutions that seemed to be blocking that progress. The old order wasn't just outdated, it was actively harmful to humanity's destiny. The same pattern emerged with dozens of other core beliefs. The divine right of kings was gradually replaced by the sovereignty of the people. Religious authority was superseded by scientific expertise. Traditional gender roles were questioned in the name of human equality. Each shift seemed natural, inevitable, progressive. But when you step back and look at the coordination across different countries and cultures, the pattern becomes unmistakable. By the 1872nd, the network had achieved something unprecedented in human history. They had successfully implanted a new operating system into Western civilization's collective mind. The values we consider natural and obvious today, individual rights, democratic governance, scientific rationality, social progress, were radical, dangerous ideas just a century earlier. But their greatest triumph was still ahead of them. The 20th century brought unprecedented opportunities for social transformation. 2 world wars shattered the old European order, creating space for entirely new forms of organization. The Russian Revolution showed that ancient monarchies could be toppled overnight. The rise of mass media meant that ideas could spread faster than ever before. And the development of modern psychology provided new tools for understanding and influencing human behavior. The networks that had emerged from the Illuminati tradition found themselves in the perfect position to capitalize on this chaos. They had spent over a century learning how to work behind the scenes, how to influence without controlling, how to shape events without leaving fingerprints. Now they had the opportunity to redesign human civilization from the ground up. The evidence of their influence during this period isn't hidden in secret archives or coded messages. It's scattered throughout the public record, visible to anyone who knows how to connect the dots. The challenge is that the dots are spread across different countries, different institutions, different decades. Only when you step back and look at the bigger picture does the coordination become obvious. Consider the remarkable similarities between revolutionary movements that supposedly developed independently. The techniques used by Lenin's Bolsheviks in Russia were nearly identical to methods employed by progressive reformers in America, socialist organizers in Germany, and nationalist movements across the developing world. Same organizational structures, same propaganda techniques, same strategies for capturing and maintaining power. These similarities weren't coincidental. They reflected a shared intellectual framework that was being transmitted through carefully maintained networks of influence. Revolutionary leaders who had never met face-to-face were using the same playbook because they had been trained by people who were part of the same hidden tradition. The key was what intelligence professionals call influence operations. Instead of trying to control events directly, the network focused on placing their people in positions where they could shape the flow of information and ideas. University professors who could train the next generation of leaders, journalists who could frame public debates, publishers who could decide which books reached mass audiences, foundation executives who could fund research that supported their worldview. This approach was far more effective than traditional conspiracy methods. When you try to control events directly, you leave evidence. Meetings, documents, money trails, all of which can be discovered and exposed. But when you focus on influencing the intellectual environment in which decisions are made, your impact becomes almost invisible. The decision-makers genuinely believe they're acting independently. They've been exposed to information and arguments that lead them naturally toward conclusions that serve the network's agenda. But because the influence operates at the level of ideas rather than instructions, there's no paper trail connecting their actions to any coordinating authority. By the 1922nd, this system was operating at unprecedented scale. The network had successfully placed their people in key positions throughout Western society. They controlled major newspapers in every important city. They dominated the faculties of leading universities. They ran the most influential think tanks and policy institutes. They had created what modern analysts would recognize as a complete intellectual ecosystem, but their most ambitious project was just beginning. Having successfully transformed the political and cultural landscape of the Western world, they turned their attention to something even more fundamental: human nature itself. The rise of modern psychology gave them tools that previous generations could never have imagined. For the first time, it became possible to study human behavior scientifically, to understand the psychological mechanisms that drove individual and group decision-making. And the network was among the first to recognize the revolutionary implications of this new knowledge. If you could understand how people really thought and felt, you could design systems that influenced their behavior without them realizing they were being manipulated. You could create what appeared to be free choice while actually channeling that choice toward predetermined outcomes. You could make people want what you wanted them to want. This wasn't theoretical speculation. By the 1932nd, the network was funding extensive research into mass psychology, propaganda techniques, and social engineering. Much of this research was conducted openly, published in academic journals, discussed at professional conferences, but the applications were far more sophisticated than most people realized. The techniques developed during this period weren't just used by obvious totalitarian regimes. They were quietly integrated into the normal functioning of democratic societies. Political campaigns began using psychological research to craft more persuasive messages. Advertisers developed methods for creating consumer desires that people didn't know they had. Educational systems were redesigned to produce citizens who were more compliant and less critically minded. The genius of the system was that it operated through institutions that people trusted: universities, foundations, professional associations, media companies, all of which maintained their appearance of independence while actually serving a coordinated agenda. The average person had no idea that their opinions were being shaped by a network of influence that stretched back to the Bavarian forests of 1776. And as we moved deeper into the 20th century, that network grew stronger, more sophisticated, more invisible. World War II provided cover for massive social experiments. The Cold War created justification for unprecedented government secrecy. The rise of multinational corporations opened new channels for influence that transcended national boundaries. By the 1962nd, something remarkable had happened. The radical vision that Adam Weishaupt had outlined in his private correspondence nearly 2 centuries earlier had become the mainstream worldview of Western civilization. Rational scientific thinking had replaced religious authority as the basis for understanding reality. Democratic ideals had spread across the globe. Universal education had become a fundamental human right. But this success raised a disturbing question. If the network had achieved everything they originally set out to accomplish, why were they still operating? What were they working toward now? And as their influence became more pervasive and less visible, how could anyone tell whether they were still serving humanity's best interests or had become something else entirely? Because here's the thing about power. It tends to corrupt even the most idealistic movements. The people who start revolutions aren't the same people who consolidate the victories those revolutions achieve. And when a network becomes successful enough to reshape civilization itself, the temptation to use that power for narrower purposes becomes almost irresistible. The trail of influence that began in the Bavarian Illuminati doesn't end with their apparent success in transforming Western society. It continues into the present day, through institutions and organizations that most people have never heard of, operated by individuals whose names don't appear in history books, but whose decisions shape the world we live in. And that's where our investigation gets really interesting. Because once you understand how the network operates, once you recognize the patterns they've used throughout history, you start seeing their fingerprints everywhere. Not in wild conspiracy theories or dramatic revelations, but in the quiet, systematic influence that shapes how we think about everything from politics to economics to the nature of reality itself. The question isn't whether the ancient Illuminati still exists. The question is whether we're living in the world they created, and whether that world is still serving the idealistic vision that inspired Adam Weishaupt in that Bavarian forest so long ago. To answer that question, we need to follow the trail into the modern era, because what happened after World War II wasn't the end of the network, it was their metamorphosis into something far more sophisticated than anything Weishaupt could have imagined. The post-war world presented unprecedented opportunities for social engineering. Entire societies needed to be rebuilt from scratch. New international institutions were being created to manage global affairs. The development of television and later digital communications would give small groups of influential people the ability to shape the thoughts of billions. And the networks that had evolved from the Illuminati tradition were perfectly positioned to capitalize on this moment. But they had learned hard lessons from 2 centuries of operation. Direct political control was messy, unpredictable, and left too much evidence. Instead, they focused on something far more elegant, controlling the intellectual frameworks that people use to understand reality itself. Think about the major institutions that emerged after 1945. The United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, NATO, the European Union. On the surface, These appear to be independent organizations created to address specific problems. But when you examine their founding documents, their operational philosophies, and the networks of people who designed them, remarkable similarities emerge. They all operate on the same basic assumptions about human nature, social organization, and historical progress. They all employ similar methods for building consensus and managing dissent. They all work toward the same long-term vision of global integration and rational governance. This wasn't coincidental. The architects of the post-war international order were products of the same intellectual tradition that had been developing since the 18th century. They had been educated at universities where Illuminati ideas had become orthodox thinking. They moved in professional circles where these concepts were discussed as established wisdom rather than radical innovations. But here's what makes this so difficult to track. By the 1952nd, the network no longer needed to operate as a secret society. Their core ideas had become so deeply embedded in mainstream thinking that they could work openly through official institutions using perfectly legal methods. The real power wasn't in shadowy meetings or encrypted communications anymore. It was in the ability to define what counted as reasonable, respectable, professional thinking. Anyone who challenged the fundamental assumptions of the post-war order could be dismissed as extremist, unrealistic, or professionally incompetent. This is how intellectual orthodoxy functions as a form of control. You don't need to silence dissenting voices when you can make them sound crazy. You don't need to suppress alternative ideas when you can ensure they never get a fair hearing in respectable forums. The network had created what social scientists call a discourse community, a self-reinforcing system of institutions, publications, and professional relationships that maintained ideological coherence without requiring central coordination. University departments hired professors who shared their worldview. Think tanks funded research that supported their conclusions. Media outlets amplified voices that reinforced their narrative. Anyone operating outside this system found it almost impossible to gain credibility or influence, not because of active suppression, but because the entire intellectual ecosystem was structured to reward conformity and marginalize dissent. By the 1962nd, this system had achieved something unprecedented in human history. It had made radical social transformation appear to be the natural result of objective, scientific analysis. The dismantling of traditional institutions wasn't presented as ideological revolution. It was framed as inevitable progress based on empirical research and rational thinking. The civil rights movement, the feminist revolution, the environmental movement, the push for global governance, all of these emerged with suspicious coordination, using remarkably similar rhetoric and organizational methods. Each was presented as a grassroots response to obvious injustices. But when you examine the funding sources, the intellectual frameworks, and the leadership networks, the same patterns appear over and over again. This doesn't mean these movements were entirely artificial or that their grievances weren't legitimate, but it does suggest that their timing, their methods, and their ultimate objectives were being influenced by forces that most participants never recognized. The genius of this approach was its invisibility. The people leading these movements genuinely believed they were acting independently. They had been exposed to ideas and information that led them naturally toward revolutionary conclusions. But those ideas and that information had been carefully curated by institutions that were part of a much larger network. This is how modern influence operations work. You don't tell people what to think, you control the information environment in which they form their opinions. You don't issue commands, you create conditions where independent thinkers inevitably reach the conclusions you want them to reach. And, as the 20th century progressed, this system became incredibly sophisticated. The development of polling, focus groups, and demographic analysis gave the network unprecedented insight into public opinion. Computer modeling allowed them to predict how different messages would resonate with different audiences. The rise of global communications meant they could coordinate activities across multiple countries simultaneously. But their greatest breakthrough came with the recognition that cultural influence was more powerful than political control. Instead of trying to capture governments, they focused on capturing the institutions that shaped how people understood reality: universities, media companies, entertainment industries, and cultural organizations. Hollywood became a particularly important battlefield. Movies and television shows didn't just reflect popular culture, they actively shaped it. By the 1972nd, the network had successfully placed their people in key positions throughout the entertainment industry, not as obvious propagandists, but as creative professionals who happened to share a particular worldview about social progress and human nature. The messages weren't crude or obvious. They were woven into compelling stories that audiences consumed as entertainment. Traditional authority figures were consistently portrayed as corrupt or incompetent. Individual rebellion against social norms was celebrated as heroic. Complex moral questions were simplified into conflicts between progressive heroes and reactionary villains. Generation after generation grew up absorbing these messages, without realizing they were being systematically conditioned to accept a particular vision of how society should be organized. By the time they reached adulthood, the ideas felt like natural common sense rather than carefully implanted beliefs. This cultural programming was reinforced through the educational system, which had been gradually transformed over the course of the 20th century. The classical curriculum that had once emphasized critical thinking, historical knowledge, and cultural literacy was replaced with approaches that prioritized emotional development, social consciousness, and adaptive thinking. Students weren't taught to question fundamental assumptions or think independently about complex problems. Instead, they were trained to recognize approved patterns of thought and apply them to new situations. Critical thinking was redefined as the ability to identify bias in traditional sources while accepting progressive narratives uncritically. The result was generations of highly educated people who genuinely believed they were independent thinkers while actually operating within extremely narrow intellectual boundaries. They could debate policy details endlessly while never questioning the fundamental premises that shaped those debates. And as we moved into the digital age, these systems of influence became even more powerful and pervasive. Social media platforms didn't just connect people, they created echo chambers that reinforced existing beliefs while filtering out challenging information. Search algorithms determined what information people could find. Recommendation systems shaped what content they consumed. For the first time in human history, it became possible to create personalized propaganda tailored to individual psychological profiles. The network no longer needed to craft messages that would appeal to broad audiences. They could create thousands of different versions of the same basic narrative, each one designed to resonate with specific demographic groups or personality types. But perhaps most importantly, the digital revolution created new forms of surveillance and social control that would have amazed the original Illuminati. Every click, every search, every social media post became data that could be analyzed to understand individual behavior and predict future actions. The network didn't just influence public opinion anymore, they could monitor it in real time and adjust their strategies accordingly. The question we need to ask ourselves is this: in a world where information flows are controlled by algorithms designed by a small number of technology companies, where cultural narratives are shaped by entertainment industries, concentrated in a few major cities, where educational curricula are determined by accreditation bodies with remarkably similar ideological commitments. How much of our thinking is actually our own? The ancient Illuminati dreamed of a world where rational, enlightened thinking would replace superstition and tradition as the foundation of human civilization. They believed that if they could free people from the intellectual constraints imposed by traditional authority, humanity would naturally evolve toward justice, equality, and progress. In many ways, they succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. The modern world operates according to principles they would recognize and approve of. Scientific rationality has largely replaced religious dogma as the basis for understanding reality. Democratic ideals have spread across the globe. Individual rights are considered fundamental human values. But success created new problems they never anticipated. When you tear down traditional sources of meaning and authority without replacing them with something equally compelling, you create a vacuum that can be filled by forces you never intended to unleash. When you convince people that all truth is relative and all traditions are oppressive, you make them vulnerable to manipulation by anyone skilled enough to exploit their confusion and isolation. The network that emerged from the Illuminati tradition may have started with idealistic goals, but power has a way of corrupting even the most well-intentioned movements. The people who control the flow of information and ideas in the modern world wield unprecedented influence over human consciousness itself. And the temptation to use that influence for personal or factional advantage, rather than humanity's genuine benefit, may be impossible to resist. This is why understanding this history matters, not because we need to fear some cartoon conspiracy pulling strings from a hidden bunker, but because we need to recognize how influence actually operates in the modern world, how ideas spread through networks of institutions and relationships, how intellectual orthodoxies develop and maintain themselves, how systems of power adapt and evolve while maintaining their essential character across centuries. The ancient Illuminati may be long dead, but the methods they pioneered are more powerful and pervasive than ever. The question isn't whether secret societies control the world, it's whether we've become so thoroughly conditioned by centuries of systematic influence that we can no longer recognize when our thoughts aren't entirely our own. And that brings us to the most unsettling realization of all. We may already be living in the world the ancient Illuminati envisioned, but it's not the utopia they promised. Instead, it's something far more complex and potentially dangerous. Consider this. Every morning, millions of people wake up and check their phones. Within seconds, they're consuming information that has been filtered, prioritized, and shaped by algorithms designed by a small number of technology companies. These algorithms don't just show us what's happening in the world, they determine what we think is important, what deserves our attention, what emotional responses we should have. The people who design these systems aren't necessarily part of some grand conspiracy, but they are products of the same educational institutions, the same intellectual traditions, the same networks of influence that have been developing since the 18th century. They share remarkably similar assumptions about human nature, social progress, and the proper organization of society. When Mark Zuckerberg decides how Facebook's algorithm should prioritize content, when Google's executives determine what search results appear first, when Twitter's leadership chooses which voices to amplify or suppress, they're making decisions that shape the thoughts of billions of people. And those decisions consistently reflect the same worldview that animated the original Illuminati, the belief that enlightened elites should guide humanity toward rational, progressive outcomes. But here's where it gets truly chilling. The modern version of this system is far more sophisticated than anything Weishaupt could have imagined. The original Illuminati had to rely on slow, careful infiltration of existing institutions. Today's networks can reshape reality in real time, adjusting their influence moment by moment based on instant feedback about how their messages are being received. Think about how quickly new social movements emerge and spread across the globe. Black Lives Matter went from a hashtag to a worldwide phenomenon in a matter of weeks. Climate activism transformed from fringe environmentalism to mainstream urgency almost overnight. The Me Too movement reshaped fundamental assumptions about gender relations across multiple cultures simultaneously. These weren't organic grassroots movements that happened to achieve global coordination through coincidence. They were carefully orchestrated campaigns that used sophisticated understanding of social psychology, network effects, and digital communications to manufacture the appearance of spontaneous social change. The playbook is always the same: identify a legitimate grievance that resonates with people's lived experience. Craft a compelling narrative that frames the issue in terms of oppressor versus oppressed. Use social media to amplify voices that support the narrative while marginalizing those who question it. Deploy institutional pressure to force compliance from organizations that might otherwise resist. Present the resulting changes as inevitable progress rather than imposed ideology. Most people participating in these movements genuinely believe they're fighting for justice. They feel the passion, the moral certainty, the sense of historical importance that comes with being part of a righteous cause. But they don't realize that their emotions are being carefully manipulated, their actions channeled toward predetermined outcomes by people who understand mass psychology far better than they do. This is the modern version of the Illuminati's ancient strategy. Use people's genuine desire for a better world to advance an agenda they would never consciously choose to support. Make them feel like heroes while turning them into instruments of someone else's will. The evidence is everywhere once you know how to look for it. Why do progressive movements in different countries use nearly identical language and tactics? Why do corporate media outlets coordinate their coverage so precisely that they often use the exact same phrases to describe complex events? Why do academic institutions across the Western world teach remarkably similar perspectives on history, politics, and social issues? Because the network that began in Bavarian forests has evolved into something far more powerful than a secret society. It's become a complete intellectual ecosystem that shapes how educated people think about reality itself. And unlike traditional conspiracies, this system doesn't require central coordination anymore. It's become self-sustaining, self-reinforcing, self-correcting. University professors train graduate students who become the next generation of professors. Journalists hire reporters who share their worldview. Foundation executives fund research that confirms their assumptions. Tech entrepreneurs build platforms that amplify voices they consider credible, while suppressing those they consider dangerous. Each individual decision seems reasonable, even inevitable. But the cumulative effect is a system that maintains ideological coherence across thousands of institutions and millions of people without anyone needing to issue explicit instructions. This is how soft totalitarianism works. You don't need secret police when you can shape what people want to think. You don't need propaganda when you can control the intellectual environment in which people form their opinions. You don't need to suppress dissent when you can make alternative viewpoints seem crazy, outdated, or morally repugnant. The genius of this approach is that it feels like freedom. People genuinely believe they're thinking independently, making their own choices, following their own moral compass. They don't realize that their moral compass has been carefully calibrated to point in directions that serve the network's interests. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this system is how it's evolved beyond the original Illuminati vision. Weishaupt genuinely believed that rational enlightenment would lead to human liberation. He thought that if people could free themselves from traditional authorities, they would naturally choose justice, equality, and progress. What he didn't anticipate was that destroying traditional sources of meaning and authority would leave people desperately hungry for new forms of guidance. When you convince people that their ancestors were ignorant, their traditions are oppressive, and their inherited beliefs are superstitious, you don't necessarily make them more rational. Often, you just make them more vulnerable to manipulation by whoever offers them a compelling alternative narrative. The modern network has learned to exploit this vulnerability with unprecedented sophistication. They don't just offer people information, they provide complete worldviews, identity frameworks, moral systems that give meaning to confused and isolated individuals. They've become the new priesthood, offering secular salvation through political activism and social progress. But unlike traditional religious authorities, they don't openly claim divine mandate. Instead, they present themselves as representatives of reason, science, and moral evolution. They don't ask for faith. They demand intellectual submission disguised as critical thinking. This is why questioning their narratives feels so difficult for most people. It's not just disagreeing with a political position, it's challenging the entire framework that gives their life meaning. To reject progressive orthodoxy feels like rejecting rationality itself, morality itself, progress itself. The psychological pressure to conform is enormous. Social media amplifies this pressure by making dissent visible to one's entire social network. Professional consequences make intellectual independence economically dangerous. Cultural stigma makes alternative viewpoints socially isolating. Most people simply aren't strong enough to resist this kind of coordinated psychological manipulation. They gradually adjust their thinking to align with approved narratives, convincing themselves that their evolving beliefs represent genuine intellectual growth rather than sophisticated conditioning. And here's the most chilling part. The system has become so effective that it may be beyond human control. The algorithms that shape information flows, the institutional pressures that enforce conformity, the cultural mechanisms that marginalize dissent, they operate according to their own logic now, perpetuating themselves regardless of what any individual wants or intends. Even the people at the top of these networks may not fully understand what they've created. They may genuinely believe they're serving humanity's best interests while actually advancing processes that could ultimately destroy the human capacity for independent thought. This is the final evolution of the Illuminati project. Not conscious conspiracy, but unconscious conditioning, so pervasive and sophisticated that it shapes reality itself. We're not being controlled by secret masters pulling strings from hidden rooms. We're being controlled by systems of influence so deeply embedded in modern life that they've become invisible, automatic, inevitable. The question isn't whether we can expose and defeat these networks. The question is whether we can recognize their influence over our own thinking clearly enough to begin the slow, difficult work of reclaiming our intellectual independence. Because make no mistake, this is a battle for the human mind itself. And right now, we're losing. The trail we followed from that candlelit meeting in Bavaria to the digital manipulation of today reveals something that should terrify anyone who values human freedom. The most successful conspiracy in history has been the gradual replacement of individual consciousness with collective programming. We think we're thinking, but we're actually processing information according to patterns that were implanted in us by systems we never chose to trust. But recognizing this reality is only the beginning. Understanding how we got here is the first step toward figuring out how we might find our way back to authentic human agency. Because buried within the history of these networks lies something they may not have anticipated, the seeds of their own undoing. The very tools they've used to shape human consciousness, can be turned against the system that created them. The networks that have manipulated us for centuries are now visible to anyone who knows how to look. And visibility, as any conspiracy theorist will tell you, is the beginning of the end for any system that depends on operating in shadows. But that's a story for the final part of our investigation, because what we've discovered so far is only half the truth. The other half, the part they really don't want you to understand, reveals not just how the system works, but how it might finally be stopped. The 20th century taught the networks something crucial about human psychology that the original Illuminati could never have understood. People don't just want to be controlled, they want to feel like they're part of something larger than themselves. They crave meaning, purpose, identity. And when you can provide those things while simultaneously shaping how they think, you don't just influence their behavior, you become the foundation of their reality. This insight transformed everything about how modern influence operations function. Instead of working against human nature, they learned to work with it. Instead of suppressing natural desires for community and purpose, they channeled those desires into forms that served their agenda. They didn't just want compliant citizens, they wanted passionate believers who would do the work of conversion for them. The key breakthrough came with the understanding that ideology functions like a virus. It spreads from person to person through social contact, but only when conditions are right. You need hosts who are psychologically receptive, transmission mechanisms that feel natural and voluntary, and environmental pressures that encourage adoption while discouraging resistance. By the 1962nd, the network had identified the perfect laboratory for testing these theories, the university campus. Here were thousands of young people, at the most psychologically malleable stage of their lives, separated from traditional support systems, hungry for identity and meaning, surrounded by peers, going through the same process of intellectual and emotional development. The transformation of higher education from institutions of learning into ideological processing centers didn't happen overnight. It took decades of careful work. First, they changed who got hired. Academic departments began prioritizing political correctness over intellectual competence. Professors who asked uncomfortable questions found themselves marginalized, while those who promoted approved narratives were fast-tracked for tenure. Then they changed what got taught. Traditional curricula that emphasized critical thinking and cultural literacy were replaced with approaches that prioritized social justice and emotional validation. Students weren't trained to analyze complex problems independently. They were conditioned to recognize oppression narratives and respond with appropriate outrage. Most importantly, they changed how students thought about thinking itself. Objectivity was reframed as a tool of oppression. Rational analysis was dismissed as masculine and Western. Personal experience became more valid than empirical evidence. Critical thinking was redefined as the ability to identify bias in traditional sources while accepting progressive claims uncritically. The psychological effects were devastating and intentional. Students emerged from this process genuinely believing they were more enlightened than previous generations while actually being far less capable of independent thought. They had been trained to mistake emotional intensity for intellectual rigor, moral certainty for wisdom, conformity for courage. But the real genius of the system was how it made these conditioned individuals feel special, chosen, morally superior. They weren't just students, they were social justice warriors fighting against oppression. They weren't just following instructions, they were thinking for themselves in ways their parents' generation never could. They weren't being manipulated. They were awakening to truths that traditional authority figures wanted to suppress. This psychological framework made them incredibly effective at spreading the ideology to others. They had the passion of true believers combined with the intellectual confidence of people who thought they had discovered profound truths through their own reasoning. When they graduated and moved into positions of influence throughout society, they brought this missionary zeal with them. The network didn't need to coordinate their activities anymore. These individuals would naturally seek out like-minded people, hire those who shared their worldview, promote ideas that aligned with their conditioning. They would police their own institutions, suppressing dissent and rewarding conformity without needing explicit instructions from above. This is how the system became self-sustaining. Each generation trained the next generation, passing on not just specific beliefs but the underlying thought patterns that generated those beliefs. The original Illuminati had dreamed of creating enlightened individuals who would transform society through rational thinking. Instead, their intellectual descendants had created something far more powerful, a self-replicating ideological machine that could reprogram human consciousness itself. By the 1982nd, this machine was operating at unprecedented scale. Progressive graduates had infiltrated every major institution in Western society. They controlled the universities that trained future leaders. They dominated the media companies that shaped public opinion. They ran the think tanks that developed policy recommendations. They staffed the government agencies that implemented those policies. But their greatest triumph was cultural. Through decades of patient work in Hollywood, publishing, and the arts, they had successfully rewritten the basic moral framework that ordinary people used to make sense of the world. Traditional virtues like patriotism, religious faith, and family loyalty were reframed as forms of bigotry. Progressive values like diversity, inclusion, and social justice became the new moral imperatives. The transformation was so complete that most people didn't even realize it was happening. Each change seemed natural, inevitable, obviously correct. Who could argue against equality? Who would defend discrimination? Who wanted to be on the wrong side of history? This is how successful psychological manipulation works. It doesn't feel like manipulation, it feels like moral and intellectual evolution. The targets genuinely believe they're becoming better people, more enlightened citizens, more compassionate human beings. They don't realize that their compassion is being weaponized, their moral instincts hijacked, their desire to do good channeled toward outcomes they would never consciously choose to support. The digital revolution supercharged these processes in ways that still aren't fully understood. Social media platforms didn't just connect people, they created massive behavioral modification systems that could influence thoughts and emotions in real time. Every click, every share, every reaction became data that could be used to refine the manipulation techniques. The algorithms that determined what content people saw weren't neutral. They were designed by people who shared the same ideological framework that had been developing since the 18th century. They consistently amplified voices that supported progressive narratives while suppressing those that questioned them. They created echo chambers that reinforced approved thinking while filtering out challenging information. More insidiously, they learned to exploit basic human psychology in ways that made resistance almost impossible. They triggered dopamine responses through likes and shares, creating addiction-like dependencies on social validation. They used fear and outrage to bypass rational thinking, making people more susceptible to emotional manipulation. They employed techniques borrowed from casino design and behavioral psychology to keep users engaged for hours at a time. The result was a population that spent most of their waking hours consuming information that had been carefully curated to shape their thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. They weren't just being influenced, they were being programmed, one scroll at a time, one click at a time, one emotional reaction at a time. But perhaps the most disturbing development was how the system began targeting children. Educational institutions that had once focused on teaching basic skills began implementing social-emotional learning programs that were actually sophisticated psychological conditioning systems. Children as young as 5 were being taught to identify oppression narratives, categorize people according to identity hierarchies, and respond to social situations with approved emotional patterns. Parents who objected to these programs found themselves labeled as extremists, bigots, or domestic terrorists. School boards that had been captured by ideologically aligned administrators dismissed their concerns as ignorant fear-mongering. The media portrayed resistance as a dangerous backlash against progress and inclusion. The children caught in the middle of these battles had no choice but to adapt to whatever framework was being imposed on them. Many internalized the programming so completely that they began policing their own thoughts, suppressing any ideas or feelings that didn't align with approved narratives. Others developed anxiety and depression as they struggled to reconcile their natural instincts with the artificial worldview being forced upon them. This is where the network's success may have exceeded even their own expectations. They didn't just want to influence how people thought about politics or social issues. They wanted to restructure human consciousness itself. They wanted to create a generation of individuals who were incapable of independent thought, who would instinctively defer to approved authorities, who would find traditional sources of meaning and identity literally unthinkable, and they may have succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. Recent studies suggest that attention spans are shrinking, critical thinking skills are declining, and psychological resilience is collapsing among young people who have grown up in this digitally mediated environment. Many seem incapable of tolerating disagreement, unable to engage with complex ideas, dependent on external validation for their sense of self-worth. But success created new vulnerabilities that the network may not have anticipated. When you make people this psychologically dependent, this intellectually fragile, this emotionally unstable, you create populations that are difficult to control in predictable ways. Anxiety and depression aren't just personal problems, they're systemic weaknesses that can destabilize entire societies. Moreover, the techniques that worked so well for previous generations may be losing their effectiveness. Digital natives who have grown up surrounded by sophisticated manipulation techniques are developing natural resistance to them. They can spot fake viral content, recognize astroturfed social movements, identify psychological manipulation techniques that their parents never learned to see. The network's own success in documenting and systematizing their methods has made those methods visible to people who know how to look. Academic research into propaganda techniques, behavioral psychology, and social engineering has created a body of knowledge that can be used to understand and resist manipulation rather than just implement it. Most importantly, the Internet that was supposed to be the ultimate tool of control has also become the ultimate tool of liberation. For the first time in human history, individuals can access information and connect with like-minded people without going through gatekeepers who might filter or distort their communications. Alternative media sources can reach millions of people without needing approval from established institutions. This creates possibilities that the network never had to deal with before. Their ancestors could control information flows by controlling a relatively small number of newspapers, publishing houses, and broadcasting companies. But the modern information landscape is far too complex and decentralized for that kind of control to work effectively. Every attempt to suppress inconvenient information triggers a Streisand effect that draws more attention to it. Every effort to silence dissenting voices creates martyrs who attract more followers. Every campaign to marginalize alternative viewpoints generates backlash that strengthens the opposition. The network that spent centuries learning to operate in shadows is being forced into the light. Their methods are being exposed, their coordination documented, their influence mapped by researchers and activists who understand their techniques better than many of the people implementing them. But perhaps most dangerously for the network, their success in reshaping consciousness has created populations that are hungry for the very things their programming was designed to eliminate: authentic meaning, genuine community, real purpose. The synthetic substitutes they've provided, political activism, social justice crusades, environmental apocalypticism, are proving insufficient to satisfy deep human needs for transcendence and belonging. This spiritual hunger is driving people to seek alternatives outside the approved ideological framework. Some are returning to traditional religious practices that the network spent centuries undermining. Others are developing new forms of spirituality that emphasize personal experience over institutional authority. Many are simply rejecting the entire system of thought control and demanding the right to think for themselves. These developments suggest that the network may have overplayed their hand. In their rush to complete the transformation of human consciousness, they may have triggered the very resistance movements that could ultimately bring down the entire system they've spent centuries constructing. The question is whether this resistance will emerge quickly enough to prevent the permanent damage they seem determined to inflict on human civilization itself. Because what we're witnessing isn't just political manipulation or cultural influence, it's an attempt to fundamentally alter what it means to be human. The stakes couldn't be higher, and the outcome is far from certain. We stand at a crossroads that the original Illuminati could never have imagined. Their dream of a world guided by rational enlightenment has morphed into something that would horrify them, a system of thought control so sophisticated that it can make slavery feel like freedom, manipulation feel like education, and conformity feel like rebellion. But within this nightmare lies an opportunity that may be unprecedented in human history. For the first time, we can see the entire system of control with perfect clarity. We understand how it developed, how it operates, and most importantly, how it might be dismantled. The network's greatest strength, their ability to operate invisibly, has become their greatest weakness. They can no longer hide behind the pretense of objectivity, neutrality, or scientific authority. Their coordination is too obvious, their methods too well documented, their agenda too transparent. And that visibility is awakening something they thought they had successfully suppressed: the human capacity for independent thought, authentic rebellion, and genuine resistance to psychological manipulation. The final battle for human consciousness has begun, and for the first time in centuries, the outcome is genuinely in doubt. What we're witnessing today isn't the endgame the network imagined when they began this centuries-long project. They expected compliance, submission, a world of grateful subjects who would thank them for their enlightened guidance. Instead, they've created something far more dangerous to their agenda, a generation that has been so thoroughly manipulated that they're beginning to recognize manipulation itself. The cracks are showing everywhere once you know how to look. The same psychological techniques that worked flawlessly for decades are now triggering immune responses in populations that have developed antibodies against synthetic narratives. People are starting to notice when their emotions are being hijacked, when their moral instincts are being weaponized, when their desire for justice is being channeled toward predetermined outcomes. This isn't happening in the ways the network expected resistance to emerge. It's not political opposition or religious revival or nationalist backlash, though all of those are symptoms of the deeper shift. What's happening is something far more fundamental. Human consciousness itself is beginning to reject the artificial frameworks that have been imposed upon it. The shadow that fell across Bavaria in 1776 still moves through our world today, but it's no longer invisible. From Adam Weishaupt's candlelit forest meeting to the algorithms that shape your morning news feed, we've traced a thread of influence that spans centuries. What began as a noble dream of enlightenment became something its founders never intended. A system so sophisticated it makes control feel like choice itself. But here's what they never counted on: the human spirit's refusal to be permanently programmed. The very tools they used to shape consciousness are now exposing their methods. Their greatest victory may become their final defeat. The question isn't whether you can resist their influence. The question is whether you're ready to start thinking for yourself again. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it, and that terrifies them more than any revolution ever could.